the idea of giving an anaesthetic in the mud in the back of a cave 2.5 kilometres underground actually didn't seem that crazy. What seemed crazy was the fact that we were planning to anaesthetise these boys and then put them under the water. I never thought that was a good idea.
12 young boys and their coach. Treacherous conditions. A technical dive through tight, dark crevices where you can't even see your hand in front of your own face. And then a deadly cocktail of drugs to anaesthetise the boys. Today on Curveball, a challenge like no other. Dr. Richard Harris takes you inside the Thai cave rescue and what it teaches us all about taking more risks. In 2011, anaesthetist Richard Harris, or Harry as he's known, received a truly terrible phone call. He was asked to retrieve the remains of his friend Agnes Malauka, who'd lost her bearings while underwater in a cave system in South Australia. She'd simply run out of air. The cave system was incredibly complex. So Harry, who's also a trained cave diver, was one of the only people experienced enough to navigate the tunnels. Harry, can you take us inside that retrieval? How did you prepare for something so traumatic?
Yeah, it's a good question. In fact, I'd been preparing for something like this for a number of years. I have the role as the Search and Rescue Officer in the Cave Divers Association of Australia, and I had been working with police and other experienced cave divers and emergency services to put together a capability to be able to hopefully rescue a live caver who had been trapped in a cave, maybe in an air bell or a rock chamber with an injury or a medical condition. And so we'd started to train to do that. And we had got some experts from the United States who sadly have a lot more experience in body recoveries. So because of that relationship that I'd established with the police, I was able to offer the services of the Cave Divers Association to assist with 2 of the 3 body recoveries because they occurred in this tank cave, which is, even for the expert police divers, is beyond their remit, beyond their commercial diving capability. So when Agnes went missing and we knew she was overdue in the cave, in fact, I was already down in Mount Gambier. I was diving in another cave and was doing a very long dive. And because I was the last one out of the water, the other divers essentially packed up and left, and just left someone on the surface to wait for me because I just had a bit of decompression to do. You have to sit underwater and let the bubbles come out of your system at a specific rate before you can come to the surface safely after a deep dive, which I'd done. So I was the last man out and had this guy on the surface with a very worried look on his face saying, "We've just heard someone's overdue at Tank Cave." And I knew that Agnes was diving over there. She was a good friend, and I just immediately had a sense that it was going to be her that was missing. So I got out of the water, got dry, and headed over there to see what was going on.
And Tank Cave is apparently quite spectacular, but once you enter these very tight, enclosed parts of the cave, visibility can drop to 0. How tricky is the terrain there?
Well, it's a real mixture. There's about 9 or 10 kilometres of tunnels and they're in a maze like a spider web, I think was one of the ways Agnes described it actually. It's a crazy place, and it's all mostly at about one level, 10 to 15 metres deep, and you can swim for a kilometre and go through all these different junctions and navigate your way through this place. And some of the tunnels are really big. There's some big chambers which are really wide open and beautiful, usually crystal clear water. But then there's also some areas that are extremely tight, so tight that you have to wriggle through with your front and your back pushing against the rock. Occasionally you even have to exhale to move forward through them. It all depends on divers' size, of course. And Agnes was quite petite. She was quite small, and she was an extraordinarily talented explorer, and she dived all around the world, and she had made a name for herself by pushing herself through this particular type of passageway. It had become her kind of special technique, and she would take cylinders off to go through, and she was essentially fearless. And because of that, she had discovered, many hundreds, if not thousands of metres of new cave passages around the world, which is what, at the end of the day, we all do this sport for. I mean, exploration is the golden fleece for cave divers. To be able to, claim a new piece of tunnel for yourself is like discovering a new mountain and climbing it. It's really exciting. But she was young, and maybe didn't really understand her own mortality, and with that slightly excessive courage that comes with youth, and although she was experienced, she hadn't had that many years of experience to maybe work out where her limits lay. She really made a mistake, unfortunately, and pushed too hard through this restrictive area, went into an area that became completely silted out, zero visibility, and ran out of air while she was looking for the exit.
So tell me why this is an appealing pastime and how you got into it in the first place, because this sounds horrendous to me. I'm claustrophobic. I don't like being underwater at the best of times. This is a highly technical, specialised skill. What drew you to diving in the first place?
Well, actually, just the words you used are one of the attractions for me, because it is so highly technical. It's very gear intensive, requires a lot of planning, a lot of logistics, and a lot of rules. Very rule-based sport. There are 5 golden or cardinal rules in cave diving, and if you break those rules, then you do put yourself at risk. But if you follow the rules and you're well trained and well equipped, then actually it's an extraordinarily safe sport. The safety record of cave diving is enviable. But because it is most people's worst nightmare, as you've just described, and that fundamental fear of the thought of being buried alive or being underwater with a finite gas supply with the clock ticking if you don't find your way out in time, I completely understand why that is a horrific concept to most people. But I'll tell you, the way I started was that, I came from the background of being an ocean diver since I was, 13, 14 years of age. And when I was at university, a group of us who were instructors at the University Dive Club decided to go down to Mount Gambier to do something a bit different, have a new experience. And initially we're diving in these big open sinkholes where the sun shines beaming down into the crystal clear water, and the beauty of those places is undescribable. The water is so clear, we use the term gin clear water to describe what it's actually like. And until you've been in that water, you have no concept of how clear water can be. Even the most beautiful tropical reef in wherever, you're swimming around looking at the tropical fish and you think this is so clear. But then you go to those freshwater caves and it just blows you away, the clarity. And to the point where actually some people feel vertiginous if they swim off into deep water and look down and see the sun shining down, and you can see 30 metres to the bottom as if it's like you're floating in air. So people feel like, I'm going to fall. It's a strange sensation. And some of the voids you're swimming around in are so vast, you can't see the walls even with a really bright light. So you feel very disorientated in space. You don't know where the top or the floor or the walls are. So some people find actually the very open nature of the caves to be quite unnerving rather than the claustrophobic tight spaces. For me, I love them all equally. I love wriggling through rocks where it's like a 3-dimensional game you have to play to post yourself through. We call it keyholing. You have to line yourself up and your equipment up just in the right way to be able to fit through. And sometimes you get a bit stuck and you feel your heart rate come up really quickly, and you have to sort of calm yourself down. It's a very meditative, mindful pastime, and the ability to stay calm and solve problems under that very real pressure is what separates people who are good at it or not so good.
You've been able to combine your passion for diving with your medical training. What drew you to medicine and then eventually a specialisation in anaesthetics?
Again, it didn't necessarily follow the path that I thought it would when I left school. I had my heart set on being a marine biologist, but I was talked out of that by one of my cousins who was studying it and said no one could get a job, so he kind of talked me out of doing it. So for me, the next best thing was to be a vet. I love animals and I love biology, so that seemed like a good mix. But actually, I missed out on veterinary science in Perth by about 2 marks, but I just managed to sneak into Flinders University in Adelaide to do medicine. So I went, oh, that'll do.
I love this.
Close enough.
You can't operate on animals, but people will be fine.
Exactly. So I don't advertise that too much, that I was too dumb to be a vet, but just smart enough to sneak into a medical school. But actually that career has suited me incredibly well. As I think it was very fortuitous in the end that I chose medicine because A, I loved it, and B, it did lead me into anaesthesia, which, I'm kind of an impatient person. I thought about being a country GP. That was my first choice because I love being in the bush, and I thought serving a community like that would be nice. To prescribe someone blood pressure tablets and then have to wait 6 months to really see the result, I found that a bit frustrating. Whereas in anaesthesia, you give a syringe of a drug and you see the results immediately, especially if you've given a bit much or a bit little, So you get that feedback, and that's kind of pharmacology and physiology in action in a heartbeat, literally. So I found that very exciting and very rewarding. And so those somewhat dry topics of pharmacology and so forth suddenly came to life for me. And I thought, actually, this is really cool. Plus, there's lots of procedures. You get to poke needles and tubes and things into people, which I enjoy. So you have to enjoy your craft. But maybe the best thing for me about anaesthesia was when you walk out of the hospital at the end of the day, if you're not on call, then you're kind of free. You don't have any responsibilities. Whereas the surgeons have their patients in hospital. They're always getting calls. They can't go away for weekends. It didn't seem like the right life to me, knowing that I wanted to spend as much time as possible.
A lot of time diving.
Out and about, yeah.
This all leads you to some work in places like Vanuatu, where you're working on medical assistance teams in the Pacific, and there's a lot of disaster response that you're involved in. How did this start to inform your views on risk, when to push boundaries and when it's actually reckless to do that?
Medicine, in a metropolitan area in the confines of a teaching hospital surrounded by high degrees of technology and expert assistance, is very comfortable in a way. You're so well supported. And then you move out to, say, a small private hospital and you do something and you find that if things go wrong, suddenly the judgment upon you is very much different. If a woman dies in childbirth, for example, that is catastrophic, clearly. But it's also catastrophic for everyone involved because, the expectations around modern Western medicine are so high that something like that is supposed to never happen. And yet childbirth has a risk. So I felt so nervous doing things like obstetric anaesthesia in those small, relatively unsupported private hospitals because I was very worried about if something did go wrong that was outside my control, what the repercussions for me would be. One step further and suddenly I'm in a country like Vanuatu practicing in a very much more austere environment, no technology. Half the time the drugs were out of date that we're using, no blood transfusion available, minimum laboratories, you name it, we didn't have it. And looking after some of the sickest and most catastrophic illness or injury that I'd ever dealt with and having some really bad outcomes. But I felt far less stressed in that environment because I knew that I'm the only anaesthetist, fully trained anaesthetist in this country, literally. So this is the best they've got, and all I can do is my best. And if I don't do it, then that patient will die. And suddenly you feel like all the pressure's off. You can only do your best. And working with such an incredibly dedicated team of local doctors and nurses, the outcomes were by and large really good. And I was amazed I was able to reflect on how good our medical training is, how lucky we are, and actually you can pretty much cope with anything if you've got good people around you with good skills. And the technology and the money we spend on medicine in Australia, for example, is really over the top in some ways. But once you've got it, you can't turn back the clock. You can't accept anything less. So that was a real eye-opener for me, and that gave me the courage to work a bit more in austere but also more challenging environments. So I spent a lot of time working with the retrieval service in Adelaide, which is part of the SA ambulance. And so flying around the state, helicopters, planes, or driving to different places to pick up trauma patients, going to road accident scenes, going to pick up someone on a farm who's had a stroke or a heart attack. And again, you're in a very small team, you're in that austere environment, and you're the best chance they've got. So it kind of removes the pressure a little bit. You just do your best, and by and large, those outcomes, again, are pretty good. So I found that really challenging, but also incredibly satisfying to work in those sort of environments.
So it's mid-2018 and you're packing your bags, getting ready to go on another diving holiday. What stopped you going?
Well, this naughty group of boys who had gone caving on a perfectly sunny day, in their defence. They'd gone into their local cave, 12 boys from the local soccer team and their 25-year-old coach, disappeared into the cave early on a Saturday afternoon and then failed to reappear that evening. And the reason they didn't reappear was that the monsoons came early and unpredictably early, and they became trapped inside the cave by rising floodwaters. And they were very lucky that they found some high ground about 2.5 k's inside the cave, and that they were able to stay above the floodwaters. They had no food with them. They were just wearing, their soccer outfit, so very light clothing. They were cold, obviously very frightened, and they were just surviving by drinking the water that was flowing past the bottom of their little hill. So I followed that story very closely because of my interest in cave rescue, and I just had a really strong sense that I needed to be there. I had a feeling that this rescue kind of had my name on it. I wasn't sure why, but, it was in our region. I had been working on developing this cave rescue capability with a group of experienced cavers and cave divers. We'd been training, and I thought, why not? So, I started contacting cavers who were involved, some expats who live in Thailand that I knew. They said, look, it's really grim. The kids are probably already dead. The rains are just flooding in now, and the water's flowing out of the entrance to the cave. It's impenetrable. You literally can't dive in there because of the strength of the water. So there's really nothing you can do. So, and then later on, as we know, a couple of British cave divers were called over there who I also knew, particularly Rick Stanton, who I'd been on a couple of expeditions with. And so I started talking to Rick and said, look, we're here if you need more divers, if there's something to be done. And then suddenly the news came in that Rick and John Valanthan, his dive buddy, had found the children. And I think we all remember that extraordinary bit of video when Rick calls out to those kids, how many of you are there? And this boy, Adul, goes 13.
How many of you? They're all alive. 13? Yeah, 13. Brilliant.
That was the moment, that the whole world sat up and took notice of this rescue, because 9 days, I think, into the rescue, suddenly all 13 of these kids are alive, way, way underground. How they survived without any food for that long, I didn't even know if that was possible in such skinny little kids anyway. And so my communications with Rick increased further, and he was really despondent. He could see no way the kids were coming out alive. The waters had settled enough for them to dive, obviously, but there's no possible way you can teach kids to dive through extremely difficult level of cave, requiring a lot of experience. So they were trying all these different things, pumping water out, drilling holes down into the cave, the Elon Musk submarine idea. Nothing was put to one side. Everything was being tried. But Rick just said to me, look, I think these kids are going to die, whatever we do. And frankly, he didn't really want to stick around to just fish their bodies out in another couple of weeks. So they were thinking about leaving. And then while I'm chatting to him, he suddenly says, oh, is it possible to sedate somebody and then dive them out? And I just said, don't be ridiculous. That's insane. You don't have to be a cave diver or an anaesthetist to recognise that if you render someone unconscious and then try and put them underwater, they're going to be dead very, very quickly. And that was pretty well informed on my part, not from just my theoretical concerns, but also some practice we'd done in our training. I'd pretended to be unconscious myself with a full face mask, which seals all the way around your face, just so you don't have to hold a regulator or a mouthpiece in your mouth. And I found that the mask would fill up with water. So I was 100% sure that could not work and that I wouldn't be any part of it. But Rick said, well, we've got no other ideas, so why don't you come to Thailand? And he sort of started the chain of events, speaking to the Australian Army officer that was there, who spoke to DFAT, who must have phoned home. And I, very shortly after that, got a phone call from Canberra saying, we think it's a good idea for you to go to Thailand to help with the cave rescue. And I went, excellent, because I'd been kind of angling for that for quite a while.
Cave diver Dr. Richard Harry Harris is my guest on Curveball. He's the author of the book The Art of Risk, and he's about to take us inside one of the most extraordinary rescues ever undertaken, a finely tuned mission to save 12 young boys and their soccer coach, all trapped several kilometres inside a cave in Thailand as the monsoonal rains continue to pour. I'm Kelly Reardon, and this is Curveball. It's the show about how you thrive in challenging moments. And I cannot think of a more challenging circumstance than the one Dr. Richard Harris is about to face. A monumental physical challenge, but also one of high emotions and moral dilemmas as Harry prepares to extract 12 teenage boys and their football coach who are trapped inside a cave in Thailand. So, Harry, you're headed on the plane over. There's expert divers from the US and Britain already there. They've been working on these plans for days. But ultimately, there's pretty much one person on the planet who can both dive and anaesthetise people. So can you take me inside your head? What was going on for you on that plane flight to Thailand?
Well, the first thing was I was quite excited to be in business class, which I'd never experienced before. So I was kind of enjoying that and accepting the glass of free champagne that the cabin crew were offering. And little did I know that there was a senior officer from the AFP tactical group a couple of rows behind me watching me, recognising my AusAid shirt on that I had. And he was more au fait with the rules and regulations of overseas deployments, which is that it's a dry situation and that you're not supposed to have anything to drink. And I was sort of thumbing through all the paper. I'd been given this huge chunk of paperwork just before I got on the plane to read about all these sort of rules of engagement. And I got up to about page 20 or glass of champagne number 3, I think, before I came across this paragraph. So the operator from the AFP actually thought I was very cool that I didn't have any regard for these rules and that I was just, but really it was just because I was so excited to be in business class. But anyway, I guess the champagne helped with the nerves a bit, but, I was pretty busy on that flight scribbling down some notes and trying to come up with a recipe for the anaesthetic should it come to that. But in my mind, I was still determined not to do it. I mean, I didn't. In fact, at no point did my conviction change during this rescue that it would result in the death of these boys. Really only on day 3 of the rescue, when we had 2 days of success behind us, did I start to think this was possible. But until that point, I was very pessimistic.
And is that because no one's done this before? Is it the combination of not knowing the anaesthetic dose plus a face mask where people don't have a regulator? Is it the technicality of this very tight dive? All of the above? All
of the above, plus about 100 other things that I could think of. Just to give you my 3 biggest concerns. Firstly, that the face mask would fill with water at some point. And, the dive was going to take 3 hours to go from where the boys were back to the entrance or vice versa. So 3 hours opportunity for a bit of water to get into that mask. And you don't need much in the little part of the face mask in front of your nose and mouth to drown you, only an inch or so. And surely that was going to happen. The second thing is that people who are unconscious need their airway looked after. If your chin falls forward, it can obstruct. If your tongue falls back, it can obstruct. It doesn't have to obstruct for long, and then it's game over. And remember, these boys are going to be underwater without any vision of them, because the water was like coffee or chocolate milk is the best way to describe it. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The only way to see a torch was to put it up against your mask in some of the sections. And they were going to be looked after probably by lay people who had no anaesthetic or critical care experience. So what possible chance was that for their airway not to obstruct at some point?
Can you talk me through the complexity of the anaesthetic alone? 3 hours sounds like a long time, as I understand it. You injected them with anaesthetic at the beginning, but somebody else had to top them up later on. And what was the cocktail of drugs?
Yeah, I mean, the primary drug which we chose was ketamine, which is an incredibly versatile and useful drug for emergency situations in particular. Ketamine's become a bit trendy and popular at the moment for a variety of other indications, like the treatment of depression and certainly for acute and chronic pain. But traditionally it's been used both in veterinary surgery. So my friend Craig, who's a vet, was actually very familiar with it as well. But it's really good in emergency settings. It's a very stable and relatively safe drug in the setting of profuse blood loss or people with difficult airways, people trapped in a car, say by their broken legs, who you need to really drag out of the car if the car's starting to smoke or, threatens to catch fire, but you need to give them some pain relief or anaesthesia. You give them a squirt of ketamine and then you can hoik them out. Anaesthetics can be dangerous in those situations for a whole host of reasons, but ketamine is the safest of all those anaesthetics in some of these particular situations. And one of the real benefits of it is it allows people to continue breathing and protect their own airway to some degree. And it also protects your blood pressure to some degree, certainly better than any other anaesthetic or sedative drugs. So ketamine was also always going to be the drug of choice. And I had used it extensively in my different types of anaesthesia or different settings of anaesthesia. But the problem is that, you give the first dose, usually intravenously. In these boys, I wasn't going to put a cannula in their vein because of the infection risk, and also intravenous drugs have to be titrated more carefully than by other routes. So the decision was to give them intramuscular injections, which is harder to predict the right dose. The time for it to start working is harder to predict, and the duration of action is harder to predict because it kind of sits there in the muscle. And if the muscle's cold, for example, it just sits there and doesn't move into your system to get to your brain. So there are all these big question marks about it. And then the other thing was you have to also keep the kid anaesthetised, and it is totally unheard of to repeat intramuscular injections as your primary technique for the maintenance part of an anaesthetic. And so there was nothing that I could find to read about how to do that, what the doses were, how far apart. So I just went back to sort of first principles, all that pharmacology and kind of practical approach to medicine that I guess I've always had gave me some starting points. And as you mentioned, I had to teach the other guys, these cave divers who were IT people or rope access workers, dive instructors, a fireman, and a vet it was good to have, my two IC. Had to teach them how to be an anaesthetist in about a 20-minute lesson.
You clearly thought this wasn't going to work. You absolutely knew the risks and you were having to navigate all of the what-ifs. Did you have second thoughts once you'd gone into the cave? Because you went in there first to sort of see the boys and assess the situation before you actually started to conduct the rescue mission. Did you have second thoughts?
Not once we started the rescue. Once the whole operation was green lit to actually go in there with the plan of doing the anaesthetic technique, absolutely no second thoughts. But the time it took to reach that decision to commit myself to it was, I think, the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And the way that kind of rolled out was that, I had 24 to 36 hours in Thailand before that decision had to be made. And as you just mentioned, Craig and I dived through the cave, firstly to make sure it was safe for us to go through, and then secondly to meet the kids and have a look at the environment in which they were living, see what their condition was, and just to make this whole crazy hypothetical a bit more concrete in my mind. And of course, in a way, it's a mistake because once you've met these beautiful kids and you've talked to them and seeing how incredibly courageous and resilient they were, I mean, seriously, I did not see one of these kids crying or a quivering lip. They were just looked like normal kids, like they were just, they were punching each other and arguing and smiling and doing all the stuff you would expect of 11 to 16-year-olds. And I thought, hang on, these are the right kids, if they looked like they'd been there for about 3 days, apart from how skinny they were. So once I'd met them, I knew I had to do something to get them out. And really it came down to this very simple decision. Either we go home and we don't try, and that means that they're going to die because, the meteorologists told us that the monsoon was coming back in about 3 to 5 days, and once it returned, that would be the end of all the diving operations because the river would become impenetrable again. It would overwhelm the pumps, and that'd be it until 3 to 6 months. So those kids would die of starvation or infection or whatever. Or we could do this thing that I thought would produce 100% mortality, but in my mind, I guess 2 things. Firstly, they would be returned to their parents, and that's a win for those families rather than having to wait many months to bring out their skeletal remains. And secondly, that when they died, that they'll be asleep when that happened. And I keep thinking what a terrible justification for a plan that is. But having worked in medicine and seen a fair bit of death and injury and suffering, I've always been of the strong conviction that quality of life is far more important than quantity, and everyone has the right to a good pain-free death. And I wouldn't do that to my dog, so I certainly wouldn't do it to one of my kids. Why would I leave them to die that dreadful death? Not to mention the psychological impact on those kids, having foolishly on our part sort of promised them we'd be back the next day to help them. I couldn't walk away from that promise. And the final thing maybe is that sometimes just action of any kind is better than no action. Just to do something, even if it's for yourself, to make yourself feel better, is far more preferable than just going away and leaving them to their fate. It's just something I couldn't have done, and I don't think any of us could have done that. So we had to try something.
One reality here, though, of course, was that you could have started the rescue because you were doing it in groups, so 3 or 4 boys at a time. You could have started the rescue, not been successful with that first group of boys. How did you and the other divers then mentally prepare for how you'd continue with the rescue if, say, the first few boys didn't make it?
There are some very interesting moral dilemmas around all this, and that's one of the biggest, obviously. And to be honest, as a group of divers, we didn't talk about that a great deal, but Craig and I were at the same hotel. We were the only Australian cave divers there, so we spent a lot of time going through all these what-ifs. And that first one, was firstly, how will I know on that first day if this is working or not? I might send 4 kids to their deaths. I was going to be at the far end of the cave and sending them out anaesthetised one by one. The 4 British divers were going to be in charge of taking them all out one at a time. I might find out when I finally get out to the entrance that all 4 have died on that day. So the first thing we did was set up a bit of a feedback loop, and that Rick Stanton would stay one chamber back from the end of the cave and wait for the first kid to come through, and then he would swim through and then tell me what the outcome from that first section was, that first dive, which was actually one of the longer dives and one of the trickier ones. So, of course, once I'd sent the first kid through, I got a bit overexcited and then immediately anaesthetised and sent the second one out. And before I remembered that part of the plan.
Oh, no.
And so that kind of overwhelmed Rick and Craig, who were in that section, by having 2 kids to deal with too soon, and caused them a fair bit of stress and hardship to get those 2 kids through that sump. But anyway, then Rick came through.
How do you not panic then? How do you stay calm when you know you've sort of stuffed up?
Well, it's a problem I've generated for someone else, I suppose. It's not my problem. But anyway, I held fire at that point and waited for Rick to come through, and he said, so far so good, those 2 kids look pretty good. So we carried on. And I remember the final kid on that first day was the one that Rick was taking out, and he was a very small boy, and he had a bit of a chest infection. I could hear that he had a loose cough, so I was a bit more worried about him than any of the others that day. So I said to Rick, I'll follow you as quickly as I can, because he was the final kid for day 1. And I remember Rick swum with this unconscious boy down the first passageway before he submerged. And it's about 50 or 60 metres away, which is the end of the canal there. And he called out to me, "Oh, Harry, this boy, I'm not even sure if he's breathing. He's barely breathing at all. And I told him, just count the breaths, and every time he breathes, just yell out, breath, to me. And the boy was breathing about 3 times a minute, which is not really sufficient. And I said, well, as we'd discussed, I'm sorry, Rick, you just got to go, and I'll come as quick as I can, because one thing you can't do is turn around and come back, and we can't wake the boy up, because every minute he's in the water he's getting dangerously cold, which was one of the real big threats I was worried about. So Rick went, I quickly got my dive gear on, said goodbye to the rest of the boys and the Thais who were in there by then, and I headed off. And as I surfaced into that dry chamber where Rick and Craig would be with that boy, I remember feeling this boy's foot under the water, because I couldn't see anything, and the first thing I felt was this leg underwater, and I thought, oh no, I've come across Rick and the boy's dead, because it felt like a dead foot, it's so cold and lifeless. But a moment later, my head pops up out of the surface, and I realised that, we're in the chamber and the boy's legs are just hanging in the water. But Craig and Rick were with the boy, and they were very worried. The boy had stopped breathing. So I quickly got out of the water, and we put him on his back, took the mask off, and he was just blue and not breathing. So I was about to start mouth to mouth on him, and I remember just pulling on his jaw to try and open his airway, and that was enough stimulation just to make him take a breath, and his colour improved really quickly. And then within 5 minutes he actually needed more anaesthetic. And that's the way this continued the whole way out for poor old Rick and this boy, is that he just, he was over anaesthetised, under anaesthetised. It was just, he's a very lucky boy.
This is just such an incredible roller coaster that's going on here. So you've got the physical feat of you doing it, but the emotion for you guys and the way you've had to act quickly when something happens. Can you just talk to me about always navigating risk and what should we do next and how should we tackle this? Like, how do you actually unpack that in the moment when you're already tired and stressed and emotional?
I think, with a lifetime of working in this type of medicine, it just becomes routine, and it's not something that you really think about. In fact, being deep mentally in that workspace, it just becomes, this is just my job. This is the fact that I was in a cave and in this weird setting was almost secondary to the patient. You've just got this patient in front of you, and that was the way I was able to deal with it, saying, well, I've just got this patient in front of me, I just have to focus on them and do what's necessary, And again, cave diving is frightening to someone who doesn't cave dive, but for us that was kind of fine. It was, it was a challenging cave, but not the worst thing we've ever done. So you put that out of the equation. An unconscious boy who stops breathing in front of me, for many people that would be terrifying, but for someone who does that for a living, well, that's not terrifying. I know what to do, and I can only do my best. So you put that out of the side. It's only when you put the whole thing together that even I sit back and go, literally, what the fuck? It is mental. And the way it all came together. But, if you've got all the individual skills, it makes it easier to put it together in a package form and just get on with it.
Incredibly, all of the boys survive, and their coach. Like, to get them all out is just unbelievable and against your predictions. So what was it that you got wrong, perhaps, with your predictions?
Everything, it seems. Apparently I was the least informed expert on the ground. The cave divers and the IT guys seemed to know much more about it, because they weren't worried at all. Or, well, they were, but, they thought it was a good idea. It was only me who said, gloom and doom, this can't possibly work. So I can explain it. The technology was important. The type of full face mask we were using was different to the ones I'd been training with. It had a positive pressure function, which means that if you breach the seal of the mask, instead of letting water in, it will just blast air out, and so that will prevent flooding. We kept the boys face down at all times, so that helps prevent water getting in. They were skinny little kids with perfect airways. I mean, if you had a 50-year-old average Australian man with a bit of a beer gut, a beard, sleep apnea and reflux, the chances of surviving that would be much, much less. But these kids were perfect, fit, healthy, skinny boys. They are the easiest thing to anaesthetise in that regard. The final thing, that hypothermia, the temperature loss in the water and under an anaesthetic, are very provocative causes to drop your core temperature, which is dangerous. And actually ketamine has a an unintended side effect that it actually constricts the blood vessels in your skin a little bit and prevents you radiating heat like any other anaesthetic or sedative drug, including alcohol, for example. We all know, the red face you get after a few champagnes in business class. So you lose heat much faster with any other sedative drug, but ketamine's the exception to that. And I hadn't thought about that either. So there's all this stuff in retrospect. I went, oh, okay, well, that makes sense and that makes sense. But I still don't want to do it again.
How do you work as a team then to conduct this incredible feat? You've got multiple rescue efforts involving rescuers from dozens of countries. There's language barriers. There's people from different services, as you mentioned. Who's in charge?
Yeah, well, there's leaders at all levels, of course, and you have to just find your immediate command and just fit into that little piece of the puzzle. You don't, in fact, you're probably discouraged from trying to understand the overall structure of these things. So you just have to know your place in the system. And for me, it was just to find the other cave divers, the other civilian cave divers who were going to become the pointy end of this operation. And really, once we put our heads underwater, we had no one to answer to. In fact, not even our teammates, because you're completely and utterly on your own once you go underwater. You can't see anyone else. You actually don't want to be near anyone else, because working closely with a diver, it's not like in the ocean where you're encouraged to have a buddy. In that setting, very tight cave, no visibility, someone else is actually a hazard to you, so it's safer to be well and truly by yourself. So really it was this group of cave divers that I had to find and communicate with, make a plan with, and then present that plan to the Thai leadership, and just to say, this is what we're prepared to do, this is what we feel we can do. And ultimately it's up to the Thais, of course, it's their country, and it's up to them to decide whether to use us as part of their operation or not.
There were lots of theories as to how best to rescue the boys. I'm just wondering, what was the key to getting everyone pulling together in the same direction under this huge stress, when I imagine people had competing interests or reasons for going with plan A, plan B or plan C? How did you get everyone on board with your plan?
I think there are a few factors working towards that being the only solution, and one was the passage of time, that slowly, one by one, the myriad of other operations and plans fell aside. Clearly the water pumping effort wasn't quite keeping up. Every time it rained, the water level would still come up, and we knew from the meteorologists that the weather was coming, and that suddenly put the clock on. We had 3 to 5 days to actually get the kids out somehow, otherwise they weren't coming out. The oxygen level in the chamber was dropping. It was down to about 15.2%, so their safety from their oxygen in the air was being compromised. All these things starting to suggest that we need to crack on with this. All the ideas, one by one, they fell away. And that's also the process that I had to go through in my mind in that 24 to 36 hours, because I had to absolutely convince myself there was no other option before I was prepared to try this madness of the sedation. And I think in a way that's what the Thais had to do as well. So they put it off as long as possible, but then when everyone realised that there's really only one thing left on the table, and there were a bunch of idiots from around the world who were prepared to give it a go, then I have huge respect for the Thais to commit to that plan and to allow us to try it. Because if you think about it, the Thai military is the government, and poor decision making is not well received in that environment, in fact can have real consequences. So for someone to put their name on that plan and say, go ahead, knowing full well from what we'd told them that there were going to be casualties, most likely, and maybe 100%, imagine the courage that took to green light that, when the option was to say, well, if we just stall for a couple more days, the rain's going to come, the kids got themselves in there, we've certainly tried very hard, but, it didn't work out. Nature took its course. No one would be critical really of the effort that had been made. I think they could have easily just taken that path of less resistance, but someone had the courage to say, no, bugger it, we're going to give this highly dangerous and unprecedented plan a go, and fingers crossed maybe we'll get 1 or 2 kids out alive.
Today it's very clear how this rescue has changed your life, but I'm wondering, what were the emotions that you felt in the immediate aftermath when you'd got that 13th person out. What was it like for you?
I couldn't understand my emotions at the time, let alone explain them to you now. I was so exhausted. We'd only been there for 4 or 5 days, and I'd had about 2 or 3 hours sleep a night, and those 12-hour days in the cave, which were pretty physical. My first emotion was, oh God, thank God I can have a sleep. Disbelief, I don't know, so kind of shocked that it had actually succeeded, and maybe all those emotions kind of trying to wash over me at once. I felt totally wrung out, and didn't quite have the strength to have an emotion almost. I do remember after I surfaced and I went up the muddy slope to this Chamber 3 area, which was a forward base, I guess, when a lot of Thai Navy SEALs had been living in there, and it was very well set up, well illuminated, lots of equipment in there. And we're all just standing around kind of looking at each other with this dumb smile on our face, and no one could really speak, but we were all just grinning and looking at each other, just sort of knowing something great had happened, but not really knowing how to put it into words. And then someone pulled out a bottle of Jack Daniels, and we passed that around with little paper pill cups, from one of the medical officers, and we're just having a little drink, and I don't know, that seemed to break the ice, and we're all just suddenly talking at once, and yeah, that was it. And then we walked out to this incredible celebration outside, which was just remarkable.
Euphoric. The response was overwhelmingly positive, including on social media right across the world, where thanks and praise were being, heaped upon you. But there was this one little comment that came from one particular medical specialist that got under your skin.
I can't even remember specifically what it was, but it just reminded me that everyone is a Monday morning quarterback, and if any of those kids had died, then it brought home to me the fact that I would have been very much on the outer in my profession, in society, and I'd feel the same way. I mean, it was madness. It was absolute madness, and I actually struggled for a couple of weeks afterwards, thinking, am I a psychopath to have done that? I mean, to put myself as the kind of executioner, to make that judgment call that this is the best thing for these kids, when I actually genuinely believed that I was essentially euthanizing them. And I thought, who was I to take that chance on behalf of those kids? And what would have happened if they had died like I thought they would have? How would I have dealt with that, let alone what would anyone else think of me? Yeah, so there was one doctor who just questioned the dose of the drugs or the choice of the drugs or something, and I just felt like saying, well, I am the world record holder of underwater anaesthesia, mate, so,
You try pull 13 people out of a cave in these conditions. As the rescue came to a close, though, this incredible high of everything that you'd achieved and the success of the operation despite all odds, you then receive some quite terrible news from home. You receive a phone call from your wife.
Yeah, well, I was texting and then calling Fiona every night to tell her I was safe, obviously, and just a bit of a debrief. She was really the only one that I could explain how I was feeling to. She is also a doctor, so she kind of knew what I was going through, I think. So I called her on that night, got back to the hotel fairly early, actually. We were too tired to have a celebration of any kind. And so I'm just chatting away, full of beans and excitement about the success of the rescue, and she's just letting me talk and listening to all that. And I guess I paused for breath, and she just burst into tears, and I said, what's wrong? And she said, oh, your dad's just died, literally a couple of hours ago, probably around the time that the last boy came out of the cave. And that just, that completely floored me. How could something so sad happen on this particular day? I knew Dad had been unwell, but he wasn't expected to be dying any minute soon. And we were very close, He was a real mentor to me, a very close friend, and I loved him dearly. So it was a pretty tough night. I didn't realise you could feel two such extremely different emotions all at the same time. So when I told everyone the next morning what had happened, the AFP who were kind of looking after us assumed that I would want to go home that day, but I'd already by the next morning I'd come to terms with the whole thing a little bit and realised that, the important thing for me was actually to debrief with all the people that had been involved. And if I'd left too soon, I don't think that important hot debrief that you have with only people who understand exactly what you've just done would have happened. And also I managed to realise that, Dad's death, he was 88, he had a nasty cancer which was going to bring him to an unpleasant end, and he just keeled over and died. It's a perfect death. And as I said earlier on, a good death is all you can hope for anyone that you love or for yourself, and that's exactly what had happened. And he was like me, he was very pragmatic about it all. For the last 10 years he'd been saying, don't worry about me, I know my time's come, you get to this age, you don't worry about it anymore, just make sure you have a good party when it happens. So that's exactly what we did, both in Thailand with all these new friends and when we got home.
You're essentially now a responsible risk advocate. Can you tell me what that means and what people get wrong about risk?
Well, I'm personally probably a slightly irresponsible risk taker, but I am an advocate for sensible risk taking. And, I've become more and more interested in the adolescent youth mental health epidemic. And initially I was sceptical about it. I thought maybe it's just an increase in reporting because we're all much more open about talking about mental health. And so young people are quick to sort of get given a diagnosis or claim a diagnosis. But the more I've researched and read about it, is a genuine thing. Young people are suffering at very high rates of anxiety and depression in particular. And I'm trying to understand why that is the case. What's changed? The world's never been safer for most of us living in a country like Australia. And young parents are also more paranoid about their children. They're restricting their movements. Just today, I heard on the news this massive outcry about white sharks in our waters because there's been another shark attack in the South Australian waters. There's been a little cluster, and suddenly everyone's like, right, net the beaches, kill the sharks, put out drum lines, monitor, whatever your position is. But it's suddenly, and the schools have suddenly said no kids are going swimming in the ocean this summer in school time. That is such a dangerous thing for our kids to be, A, instilled with a fear of the ocean, and B, to restrict them from doing things that are proven to be good for them. Outdoor activity is without question good for our mental health. And I think it's a combination of a lot of things, but obviously the advent of social media and smartphones, which is a very recent still, this increasing screen time and loss of the ability to play outdoors and play independently without structure, and schools not letting kids be winners and losers because, when I was at school, I couldn't kick, I couldn't catch, I couldn't run, I couldn't jump. I was hopeless, and I was told in no uncertain terms, mate, you're a loser. You need to find something different. And you know what? Instead of falling into a heap, I just went and found something different. I started to embrace diving and bushwalking and, more individual activities. And I've found a course through life that has been fantastic for me.
Do you think it's also around litigation? I can remember my kids being in the first few years of primary school, and there was a rule that kids couldn't play on the playground equipment before school because there weren't teachers there to supervise them. And instead, they're all just sitting under cover, not getting any sunshine, not running around, not jumping off stuff. And I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen here? Someone's going to fall off and break their arm, right?
Yep.
It's going to be okay.
And, I hate saying things like in my day because my father said it and his grandfather said it, and we all think the next generation is weak and worthless, right? But this has really changed in the last 20 years because even when I was a kid, we climbed trees and no one was watching. I fell out of trees several times. I got hurt, but I didn't go to hospital. I knocked all my front teeth out doing stuff. Everyone wore their plaster on their arm as a badge of honour at school. And whilst you had some physical injuries, and yes, cars were less safe and there were some real dangers around, people were more robust. People never talked about anxiety or depression when I was at school, and partly that's under-reporting and the fear of stigmatism, but it was genuinely less of a thing. And we've got to get kids back outside, and we've got to let them ride their bikes to school or be more independent, discover their own environment, their own geographical boundaries, and actually let them learn to be risk managers. Because if you can't manage risk yourself, the first time there's some genuine danger, you're in danger and you won't know what to do. Risk is a normal part of human development, and it's actually incredibly important for us. So if we don't let our kids learn to swim in the ocean, maybe there'll be more drownings. There'll certainly be more obesity, more diabetes and other dangers, but it just takes a while for that to be revealed.
So for those of us who aren't cave divers or extreme athletes in any way, how do we assess risk in our own life or with our children? How do you know when something is really too risky versus I'm just a bit scared to do this?
Well, by incremental exposure to things that are perceived to be risky. You don't have to be a mountaineer or a hang glider or a base jumper or a cave diver. You don't have to do an adventure activity to explore risk. You just need from a young age to get on your bike and be allowed to go to the park and hang out with your mates and make some mistakes and get told off, or occasionally even get brought home by the police like I was when I was a kid, and you learn from your parents. Okay, that was risky because now I'm getting in real trouble at home. So I'm not going to do that again. Risk is relative to, your stage in life. You just need to constantly push your boundaries a little bit. That's exploration at the most basic level. And until you're allowed to do that, you don't learn where those boundaries lie. Do something that makes you uncomfortable or that makes you scared. For me, public speaking was my biggest fear ever. And through life, you just have to do it in some form or another. When you're a doctor presenting at a ward round, or, then you present at a bigger meeting, or heaven forbid you become Australian of the Year and you have to talk to 6,000 people on a regular basis.
And host your own podcast, as you do.
And that was another thing. That was just like, oh, that's scary. I'm going to do that. And then you become more comfortable with it. I'm still nervous. Just even coming to a podcast like this, I still feel those butterflies, but it's the best way to get on top of it.
Harry, thank you for joining me on Curveball.
Thanks, Kelly.
Dr. Richard Harris, an anaesthetist and one of the cave divers of the centre of that incredible rescue of a soccer team trapped inside a cave in Thailand. He's the author of the book The Art of Risk, which explores stories of people who like to take risks, like sailor Jessica Watson and free solo climber Alex Honnold. And along with his diving mate Craig Challen, Harry's also the co-author of Against All Odds, their inside account of that Thai cave rescue. Together, the pair were named Australians of the Year in 2019. Curveball's produced by Dead Set Studios. Don't forget to leave us a review. It really does help other people find the show. This episode was produced by Liam Reardon and Harry Hughes. The executive producers are Rachel Fountain and me. You can find out more about this episode and others prior to this one at curveballshow.com.